Today we're going to be covering the psychosocial development, and that relates to the interplay between social factors and individual thoughts and behaviors. So we're going to start off by discussing two theories of psychosocial development. So Sigmund Freud and Erikson are the theorists that we're going to be looking at today. Then we're going to have a look at the development of self-concept and moral reasoning. And finally, in part 4, we'll discuss the effects of exercise on psychosocial health and well-being. So we move on to the next domain of human development. From last week we did cognitive, now psychosocial. People tend to confuse these two, cognitive and psychosocial processes, so it's important to remember that cognition involves our mental processes and the way that we learn, whereas psychosocial characteristics describe the influences of social factors on an individual's mental health and behavior. So we have all of these key elements of psychosocial development: emotions, moral capabilities, self-esteem, personality, and we're going to examine the development of each of these factors throughout this lecture, and we'll discuss how they relate to health, physical activity, and exercise. So we'll begin by looking at the features and development of our personality. Now, there's lots of different ways to describe and measure personality. For example, according to traditional Chinese medicine, our personalities depend on the balance between 5 elements: the earth, wind, water, metal, and fire. Some people believe our personalities are influenced by our date of birth and our star sign. There are even BuzzFeed quizzes that determine what kind of Disney princess or Harry Potter character you are. So we've been trying to categorize our personality for years. And more recently, with the developments in psychological research, we've been able to categorize all of the different features of personality into these 5 key traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. You can remember those 5 by using the acronym OCEAN. So the starting letter of each of those words spells out ocean. Each of these traits is on a scale. So, for example, someone high in openness might be curious and open to new situations, whereas someone lower on the end of that scale is more practical, prefers routine. Someone high in conscientiousness, hardworking on the lower end of that scale, they're more disorganized, more careless. In terms of extroversion, so high extroversion being that outgoing person seeking adventure, the lower end of that scale being introversion being quiet and withdrawn. Agreeableness, if you're highly agreeable, you're someone who's helpful and empathetic. And if you're on the low end of agreeableness, you might be a little bit more uncooperative. And then finally, neuroticism. So neuroticism, it's like our emotional stability. If you're high on that scale, you're someone who might be anxious, prone to negative emotions. And lower on that scale is someone who's calm and even-tempered. So it's important to remember, though, that we aren't stuck within our traits. For example, if you have a look at this graph and you try and pinpoint within each of these 5 traits whereabouts you would be lying on the higher end or the lower end, it doesn't mean that you're stuck there. For example, someone with low extroversion could still, get up on a night out and belt out a song at karaoke. It doesn't mean that they're always introverted. So these traits are better at predicting average behaviors rather than what we do in every specific situation. Now, there's 2 key theorists that aim to explain our personality and how our psychosocial traits develop. Sigmund Freud, he thought that our personalities depend on our success in resolving sexual urges from an early age. And he outlined this in his psychosexual theory. Now, after Freud, there was Erikson, and Erikson expanded on Freud's theories, though he did have less emphasis on these sexual factors that Freud was so obsessed with. So let's talk about Freud for a bit. He's one of the most famous and probably the most controversial developmental theorists, and his psychosexual theory of development offers a pretty unique way of looking at the body and the mind and the connection to personality. So Freud's psychosexual theory focuses on the impact of sexual and aggressive drives on an individual's psychological functioning. He believes that the first 5 years of life are crucial in shaping our adult thoughts and behaviors, and he also thought that life was built up around tension, and that tension being very sexually orientated, so focused a lot on libido and sexual energy, and believed that each person's innate drive was to seek pleasure. So there's a few key features to his theory. We're going to talk about the domains of consciousness, his three structures of personality, which are the id, the ego, and the superego. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about his 5 stages of psychosexual development. Okay, so Freud developed a theoretical model of the mind, and he used an analogy of an iceberg to describe these 3 levels of consciousness. Now, the conscious mind consists of all the mental processes that we are currently aware of. This is seen as the tip of the iceberg. It's our thoughts and our perceptions. The subconscious contains our thoughts and our feelings that we're not currently aware of, but can easily be brought to the conscious. So it's sort of like this mental waiting room where our thoughts and our memories are stored and remain until we need them. And then finally, the third component is the unconscious. The unconscious mind comprises the mental processes that are inaccessible. We cannot become aware of them, but they influence our judgments, our feelings, and also our behaviors. Now, Freud believed that the unconscious mind, which houses our deepest sexual and aggressive instincts, is the primary source of human behavior. So it's like our feelings, our motives, and our decisions are heavily influenced by our past experiences that are stored in the unconscious. Now, if you've heard of Freud before, you probably have heard the term Freudian slip. The Freudian slip, it's an unintentional error that is said to reveal a subconscious or an unconscious feeling. So it's sort of like a verbal mistake. For example, you're booking at a restaurant at a table for 6 people, but when you call up, you accidentally say, I want to book a table for sex. Or if I accidentally say that the definition of subconscious will be in the exam. Oops, little Freudian slip there. So this theory of a Freudian slip being some sort of verbal mistake that shows your true unconscious intentions has since been disproven. Freudian slips are more so just about anxiousness or nervousness or the white bear problem. So if you haven't heard of the white bear problem, right now, I want you to all think about anything except for a white bear. Do not think about a white bear. Think about anything apart from a white bear. Do not think about a white bear. Now, I'm sure that none of us can get that picture of a white bear to escape our minds. It's this psychological process where by deliberately trying to suppress a certain thought, it makes it more likely to surface. Now, Freud applied these 3 systems to his structure of personality. Probably one of the most important ideas that Freud had was that the human personality has more than one aspect. Now, according to Freud, there are 3 parts of our personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. So let's have a look at the id first. Now, the id is like the bad boy. It's the little devil on your shoulder. It seeks pleasure and avoids pain at all costs. So it involves our basic drives, hunger, thirst, sex, and it doesn't consider the feelings of others or societal norms. So it wants to achieve this immediate satisfaction. For example, when you lie to your friend to protect your image, or when you cut ahead of someone in a line so that you don't have to wait as long, you're operating according to this pleasure principle of the id. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is the superego, and it is the component of personality that consists of an individual's moral standards. And then in the middle is the ego. Now, this isn't the same as like you've got a big ego, someone who thinks that they're all that. This is a completely different thing. So this ego here, it's the rational component of personality, and it seeks to satisfy our urges in a realistic manner. So it sort of tries to find that balance between the id and the superego, between our instincts and our morality. Now, let's talk about an example of these three components of personality at play. So, for example, when you sat down to listen to this lecture, you're probably thinking, why do I have to listen to this lecture? I hate studying. Your id would have been putting pressure on you to do something more pleasurable, like go on Netflix or scroll through Instagram. Now, on the other side, you have the superego, which is your morality, and the superego is going to try to convince you to watch the lecture. It's the right thing to do. Watching the lecture will help you pass the subject so that you can get a degree and then get a job. And the superego will reward you with pride once you finish this lecture. You'll think, wow, good on me. I'm so glad I did that lecture. I'm such an amazing student. If you don't watch the lecture at once, the superego will make you feel shameful. You'll feel like, oh, wow, I'm a really terrible student. I should have watched the lecture. I'm never going to succeed. And then in the middle, finding the balance between those two is the ego. The ego works by the reality principle, so it looks at the current situation and considers what really makes sense. Should I watch the lecture right now, or should I not? Do I have the time to watch the lecture right now? What's in my best interest? So the ego considers both sides and makes a decision between the two. Now, finally, we have the stages of psychosexual development, and I'm not going to outline them here because they have been disproven by many modern psychological researchers. Freud proposed 5 psychosexual stages where children had to overcome a conflict related to sexual urges. The stages were called oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. Freud is one of the most prominent developmentalists, and a lot of his proposals and his theories were important in developing our basic understanding of personality. However, these psychosexual stages have received a lot of criticism. For example, one of the components, you've probably heard someone who is OCD and a clean freak being called anal. You call someone who's, really obsessed with cleaning, or they're so anal. Have you ever thought about why they're called anal? What does being a clean freak have to do with your bottom? This saying came from Freud's stages. He believed that if a child wasn't potty trained correctly, they would grow up to be anal retentive and over-obsessed with cleanliness. Freud also believed that around ages 3 to 6, children become sexually attracted to their opposite sex parents. So he said that boys develop this Oedipus complex where they view their father as competition for affection from their mother. He said that the reason that young boys don't express their sexual attraction to their mum was because they feared that the father would castrate them if they expressed their sexual desires. And he also said girls had the same thing. So girls aged between 3 to 6 develop this Electra complex where they're sexually attracted to their fathers. He also believed that girls of this age experience penis envy. So girls get jealous of males because they wish they too could have a penis. So take from that what you will, but you can see why these theories of Freud are so widely criticized. They're sexist and they're not backed by any research. So let's move on to talk about Erik Erikson. Now, Erikson believed that personality developed in a series of stages, and unlike Freud's theory of psychosexual stages, Erikson's theory described the impact of social experiences across the whole lifespan with less emphasis on sexual urges. Erikson was interested in how social interaction and relationships played a role in the development and growth of human beings. Okay, so Erikson took Freud's controversial theory of psychosexual development and modified it as the psychosocial theory. So according to Erikson's psychosocial theory, we experience 8 stages of development over our lifespan. So from birth all the way through to death. And at each stage, there's this crisis or a task that needs to be resolved. Successful completion of the task will result in a sense of competence and a healthy personality. But failure to master these particular tasks can lead to feelings of inadequacy. So let's have a closer look at each of these stages. So the first stage is trust versus mistrust, and that goes from birth to 2 years. And infants need to learn that adults can be trusted. Now, at this point in development, when a child is born, it's completely dependent upon an adult caregiver or a parent for everything it needs to survive. So things like food, love, warmth, safety, nurture. So an unresponsive caregiver or an unresponsive parent who doesn't meet the baby's needs can promote feelings of anxiety, fear, or mistrust, and their baby might see the world as unpredictable when they grow up. So if these infants are treated cruelly or their needs aren't met appropriately in this stage from birth to 2 years, they'll likely grow up with a sense of mistrust for people in the world. Now, work by some researchers, Harry and Margaret Harlow, demonstrated the importance of trust in forming healthy attachments during childhood. They actually performed what would now be considered a very cruel experiment. They were breeding these little baby monkeys, and as soon as they were born, they separated them from their mothers. When they separated them from their mothers, they put them in a cage, and in the cage there were 2 artificial mothers, and they're pictured here. So the baby monkey had this choice between the cloth mother and the wire mother. Now, the cloth mother was exactly what it says. It was like this cylinder covered in a nice comfy cloth, but it didn't have food. It was purely comfort. And then the wire mother was a chicken wire shaped cylinder that did have food on it. So what they found was that when they put these monkeys in these cages with the 2 choices of mothers, the monkeys overwhelmingly preferred the cloth mother, were attached to the cloth mother. Some of them even stood on the cloth mother whilst trying to get food from the wire mother. And this study showed that attachment is not solely based on food. So you may have previously thought that a newborn child, is only attached to its parents because that's its food source. Well, this study showed that comfort was of greater importance for attachment. Now, what was really interesting was what happened to these monkeys once the experiment was over. How did they cope for the rest of their life after being separated from their mothers and not developing this trust at birth? And the researchers saw so many horrible disturbances in these monkeys once the experiment was over. So after the experiment was done, these baby monkeys were refusing to eat. Some of them were rocking back and forth in a trance. Some of them were self-mutilating. And then those who survived and were forced into pregnancy never knew how to care for their babies. So this study of the monkeys was the basis of our knowledge about how a child is raised early on can have a huge effect on how they view the world, themselves, and other people. Also, how they react to stressful situations and work out moral dilemmas. So that formation of trust is really important in the overall development of a person. The second stage of Erikson's theory of psychosocial development takes place during early childhood and is focused on children developing a greater sense of personal control. So these toddlers aged 2 to 4 years begin to explore their world. They learn that they can make decisions for themselves, and they show clear preferences about food. They might have a favorite toy or a favorite outfit or a favorite piece of clothing. So their task in this stage is to resolve the issue of autonomy versus shame and doubt by working to establish independence. So autonomy is defined as the capacity to make an informed decision. And for example, we may observe a growing sense of autonomy in a 2-year-old child who wants to choose her clothes and dress herself for the day. Now, although her outfit might not be appropriate for going to school, her input in these decisions affects her sense of independence. Now, if children are denied the opportunity to make decisions, they may begin to doubt their abilities, which could lead to low self-esteem and feelings of shame throughout the lifespan. Okay, so once children reach the preschool age, so 4 to 5 years, they need to resolve the task of initiative versus guilt. So initiative, which is a sense of ambition and responsibility, occurs when a parent allows a child to explore within their limits and then supports the child's choice. So these children who are allowed to develop this sense of initiative will develop self-confidence and feel a sense of purpose throughout their lifespan. Whereas those who are unsuccessful at this stage might develop feelings of guilt throughout their life. So they may be unsuccessful due to over-controlling parents or possibly strict teachers as well. Now, during the primary school stage, so ages 5 to 12, children face the task of industry versus inferiority. Children begin to compare themselves with their peers and see how they measure up. They either develop this sense of pride and accomplishment in their schoolwork, sports, social activities, even family life, or they feel inferior and inadequate because they feel like they don't measure up to their peers. Now, this may result in the development of an inferiority complex in adolescence and into adulthood. Okay, now we have the fifth stage, which is during adolescence, so ages 13 to 19 years old, and they face this task of identity versus role confusion. Now, during adolescence, one of the main tasks is developing a sense of self. Typically, during your teenage years, you struggle with those questions that are, constantly asked to you at, family gatherings, like, what do you want to do with your life, or who are you going to be when you grow up? And along the way and during the teenage years, we try out many different selves or phases to see which identity fits best with us. So I'm sure most of you went through some sort of emo stage in high school, or maybe it was a rebellious phase. And adolescents who are successful at forming this identity have a strong sense of self, and they're able to remain true to their beliefs and values. Now, when adolescents don't make a conscious search for identity during those years, or perhaps they're pressured to conform to their parents' ideas for the future, they might develop a weak sense of self and experience role confusion. So they'll be unsure of their identity and confused about the future. And teenagers who struggle to adopt this positive identity are likely going to struggle to find themselves as adults. So then we move into adulthood, and we're looking at the sixth stage, which goes from the 20s to the 40s. People in early adulthood are concerned with intimacy versus isolation. Now, after we've developed this sense of self in adolescence, we're ready to share our lives with someone else and form a relationship. Now, Erikson said that we need to have a strong sense of self before we can develop a successful relationship with someone else. And adults who don't develop a positive self-concept in adolescence may experience feelings of loneliness and emotional isolation in early adulthood. Now, the next stage is generativity versus stagnation. And this is the task of middle adulthood, so 40 to 65 years. Now, generativity refers to making your mark on the world. So during this stage, middle-aged adults engage in meaningful and productive work, which they view as contributing positively to society. And those who don't master this task may experience stagnation and feel as though they're not leaving their mark on a world in a meaningful way. They might have little connection with others and little interest in productivity or self-improvement. So the final stage goes from the mid-60s to the end of life, and we're in this period known as late adulthood, and our task is called integrity versus despair. Erikson said that people in late adulthood reflect on their lives and they feel either a sense of satisfaction or a sense of failure. Now, people who feel proud of their accomplishments throughout their life feel a sense of integrity, and they can look back on their lives with few regrets. However, people who aren't successful at this stage may feel as if their whole life has been wasted. They tend to focus on what would have, or what should have, or what could have been. So they face the ends of their lives with feelings of bitterness, depression, and despair, which is very sad. Okay, so that is it for our developmental theorists. We've finished up talking about Freud. We've gone over Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. Now we're going to have a look at self-concept and morality. Okay, so one of the biggest achievements in adolescence is developing a positive self-concept or sense of self. It's that understanding of who we are, and we spoke about it briefly in Erikson's psychosocial model. Now, kids with a positive self-concept generally grow up to be more happy, confident, more independent, and more sociable humans. And there's 3 components to our self-concept that we're going to look closer at. So there's the view that you have of yourself, which is your self-image, how much value you place on yourself, which is self-esteem, and what you wish you were really like, which is your ideal self. And you can see those 3 components here. So the self-image, the ideal self, and the self-esteem, which is how much worth we place on ourselves. Now we're going to look closer at self-esteem. So as we go through our life, our self-esteem fluctuates. Young children have very high self-esteem, which gradually declines over the course of childhood. So it's been speculated that this high self-esteem in childhood is due to kids having an unrealistic positive self-view. So as children begin to develop cognitively, they begin to compare themselves to others. They compare academic success, social skills, and they compare attractiveness. So as an example, as a child moves from preschool to primary school, they begin to receive more negative feedback from teachers, parents, and peers, and so their self-evaluations correspondingly become more negative. Self-esteem continues to decline through adolescence. Now, this may be due to a decline in body image or other problems associated with puberty. Body image is very closely related to self-esteem. Now, self-esteem gradually increases through adulthood. This has been suggested to be because midlife is characterized by increased feelings of self-worth, increased levels of maturity, adjustment, and emotional stability. And then self-esteem declines in old age. This may be due to changes in roles, so things like retirement, changes in relationships like the loss of a spouse, or changes in physical functioning like health problems. Now, if we compare male and female self-esteem, the men are in the red line there and the women are in the blue line. They generally follow a similar trajectory. Now, men and women both begin with the same level of self-esteem in that early childhood, and the largest and first gender gap occurs in adolescence. Now, this gap between men and women persists through adulthood and then completely disappears in older age. Now, there's numerous theories as to why there is this gap between men and women. Maybe it's due to women having a lower body image. Maybe it is due to the way that men versus women are treated in society. There's numerous theories as to why there's this gap, but none of them have been widely accepted. Now, self-esteem is a really important personality trait. Researchers have shown that self-esteem influences the development of many important life outcomes. And we can see here there's relationship status and depression. And what they did was measured all of these people and put them into groups of individuals with high self-esteem, individuals with low self-esteem, and then the average trajectory. So in each of these figures here, that solid black line in the middle is the average trajectory. Those people with higher self-esteem showed greater relationship satisfaction and less likelihood of depression, whereas those with constantly low self-esteem showed lower relationship satisfaction and higher likelihood of depression. And it not only influences this relationship satisfaction and depression, there's many different influences, including job satisfaction, positive and negative emotions, and even physical health. So self-esteem is a really important personality trait that develops during adolescence. Now, in addition to the growing sense of self-concept and self-esteem, another important landmark of childhood and adolescence is the ability to tell right from wrong, which gives us our morality. So Kohlberg is another psychologist who was interested in the moral reasoning behind people of different ages. And he came up with this Heinz dilemma. So you've probably heard it before, the Heinz dilemma. All right, it goes like this. A woman is dying from cancer. There's a special drug which might save her, but the medicine costs a lot of money. Her husband, Heinz, can't afford it, and he's tried everything to raise the money. He's tried fundraising, he's tried to beg the pharmacists, but nothing has worked. So he decides to steal the drug. Was he wrong in stealing the drug? Now, Kohlberg wasn't interested in the answer, whether he was right or wrong. Rather, he wanted to know the reasoning behind the choice. And he ended up organizing everyone he asked responses into 3 basic levels of moral reasoning. The first one is pre-conventional morality, and he saw this in children younger than 9 years old. Now, they were concerned with obedience, so obeying the rules, and self-interest. And now the children in this stage, those who said that he was in the right said that because he'll be happier when he saves his wife, even if he has to go to prison. So he's doing it within his own self-interest. And those who said he was wrong believed he was wrong because he will be put into prison, which means he is a bad person. So that is related to obedience. The next level is conventional morality, and he saw this mainly in early adolescence. There's an emphasis on conformity and law and order, so it's obeying these rules, and they're really concerned with what would other people think. So those people who said he was in the right said that that was because his wife will live, but he has to be punished for the crime that he committed. Those that said he was wrong said that because stealing is bad and the law prohibits stealing. So during adolescence, our moral compass seems to shift and we're more concerned with the rules. Now, in post-conventional morality, we're talking adolescence and beyond now, we have more complex moral reasoning, and we begin to account for differing values and basic human rights. So people in this stage understand that laws are important, but some situations might overrule the law. So those who said he was correct said that everyone has the right to choose life regardless of the law. Those that were against said that others may need the medicine just as badly and their lives are equally significant. So why should he get the medicine for his wife but not others? Okay, so we're on to part 4 now, which is exercise and psychosocial health. Okay, so there are many components of psychosocial health. So we're going to spend some time now looking at how exercise affects a select few, including depression, anxiety, self-esteem, mood, and pro-social behavior. Now, physical activity is said to contribute to psychosocial health in the following ways. So it can either treat or prevent mental illness and disorders. It can also improve the mental and physical well-being of those with mental health disorders, and it can also improve the mental and physical well-being of just the general population. So those are the 4 key ways that activity contributes to psychosocial health. Now, if we have a look at some Australian statistics before we get into it, 1 in 7 Australians will experience depression in their lifetime, and it's higher for females with 18% of all females and 12% of males. And even more people experiencing anxiety, with 1/4 of Australians experiencing some sort of anxiety condition in their lifetime, 32% females, and a little less at 20% males. So let's have a look at the association between physical activity and depression. Now, there was an association found between inactivity and incidence of depression in this study back from 1991. So they categorized a whole bunch of people into low, medium, or high physical activity, and then they calculated the risk of them developing depression. Now, what they found was that the risk of developing depression was significantly greater for both men and women who were on the low end of the physical activity scale compared to those who were highly active. And we can see there's a large effect in that decreased risk of depression from low to moderately active, and the effect is a little bit less when we talk about going from moderate to highly active. So if we can get someone who is basically sedentary to be moderately active, we can see this quite large decrease in their risk of depression. If we get someone who's moderately active and move them and try and get them moving into this high activity category, we'll still see a decrease in the risk, but just not as big of a magnitude. Now, how does exercise as a treatment for depression measure up? So in this study, Blumenthal in 2012, they had 3 groups of depressed people. One group was a placebo, so they weren't receiving any treatment. One group got Zoloft, which is that yellow square in the middle, and that's the other name for Zoloft, which is an antidepressant medication. And then the third group had a 16-week aerobic exercise intervention. And what they saw was that this HAMD is an assessment of depressive symptoms. So what they saw was that exercise resulted in greater reductions in depressive symptoms compared to the placebo. We can also see that it resulted in slightly better symptoms compared to Zoloft. However, because the results weren't significant, we could say that the exercise treatment was equally as effective in reducing depression as Zoloft, a pharmaceutical antidepressant. So this study really showed us that exercise is comparable with established pharmacological therapies for depression. So if you've ever heard that saying that exercise is medicine, here's the proof. Now, since then, further research has shown that exercise combined with antidepressant medication can produce even greater declines in depressive symptoms than either one of these alone. So, what are the mechanisms behind this? How does exercise decrease our risk of depression? And if we've already got depression, how does exercise reduce our symptoms? So, there's a biological and psychosocial model of exercise and depression. So, biologically, we see increases in serotonin, increases in endorphins, and decreases in cortisol. So, the two that you're probably most aware of and that we hear the most often are the increases in serotonin and endorphins. And these are neurotransmitters that travel to the brain and play an important part in regulating our mood. And then psychosocially, exercise has these three key outcomes that result in an improvement in depressive symptoms. So we have mastery of new skills and techniques. We have social interaction. If we're in a group exercise class, we're chatting to new people. And then we also have distraction. So exercise might be that 1 hour of a day where you can get out of the house, you can get out of your own head and distract yourself. And those three psychosocial factors combined result in this improved depressive symptoms. So not only does exercise affect depression biologically, but also psychosocially as well. And here are the two key models of that. So what are some key points in regards to physical activity and depression? We know that physical activity is associated with a decreased risk of developing depression. Both aerobic and resistance exercise can be used to treat moderate and severe depression. The antidepressant effect of exercise has been shown to be the same magnitude of other techniques like antidepressant medications. And there's no negative effects of exercise in depressed populations. So why not give it a go? It can only improve the situation. Now, what's interesting is that data has shown that there are negative attitudes towards psychotherapy, whether that's seeing a psychologist or taking antidepressants. So there's been increased interest in alternative treatment options for depression. Now, keeping in mind that exercise shows no side effects like medication does, things like withdrawal symptoms, weight gain, dry mouth, insomnia, all are symptoms of all the side effects of medication. Exercise doesn't have any of those negative side effects, but it also shows potential in other health benefits like weight reduction, increased muscle mass, increased bone density. And so it's highly recommended to use exercise as a supplementary treatment for depression. Okay, so let's have a look at anxiety now. Now, anxiety, it's not only that state of worry, nervousness, anxiousness in the head. It's not just a cognitive response, it's also got a somatic response. So it's associated with this heightened awareness, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, sweaty palms, muscle tension. Now, the signs and symptoms of elevated anxiety are often grouped into two distinct categories. There's state anxiety and there's trait anxiety. So state anxiety refers to an acute, transient psychological response to some sort of event or stimulus. So it's situational in nature, like you've got to go up and do some public speaking. Now, on the other hand, we have trait anxiety, which is a chronic, long-term tendency to become anxious. And this is often seen with these generalized anxiety disorders. So it's that anxious feeling on a daily basis. So let's talk about how exercise can influence anxiety. Now, if we're discussing state anxiety, which is that situational anxiety, think going up to do public speaking, what they've found is that a single exercise session prior to that event can reduce state anxiety. So if you have a big speech to give one day, you might want to go out and go for a run in the morning, because the greatest effect of this decrease in state anxiety is when the exercise type is aerobic. So in comparison to resistance training and things like that, aerobic shows the greatest effect in that decrease in state anxiety. In terms of trait anxiety, we've also seen that a period of exercise, so a more chronic period of exercise, which means exercising over a long period of time, can reduce trait anxiety, so our daily anxious feelings. Now, the greatest improvements are seen when people exercise for over 10 weeks. So an exercise session of, if you plan to exercise for 4 weeks, you're probably not going to see much of a reduction in trait anxiety. You need to continue that for at least 10 weeks and then forever after that, basically. So the exercise sessions also should be around 40 minutes long for the greatest effect as well. Now, what about that physiological stress response that we spoke about, how anxiety results in that increased heart rate, the sweaty palms, the high blood pressure? Well, what studies have found is that people who perform exercise have a reduced reactivity to stresses. So let's take this as an example. We have two groups of people. One of them performs regular exercise. The other group is sedentary. Now, we're going to put all of these people in a stressful situation. Let's say we'll make them all do public speaking. Now, what we would find is likely that those who perform physical activity regularly have a decreased physiological response. So a decreased heart rate, a decreased blood pressure, a decreased muscle tension in comparison to those who are sedentary. They're likely to have a greater physiological stress response. So not only does exercise help the emotional and cognitive components of anxiety, it can also influence the physiological components of anxiety as well. Now, panic disorders is a really interesting one. So this is people who have panic attacks. We've seen that physical activity can improve symptoms of panic disorders. However, there's not too much research in this area. However, what has been found is that physical activity is often avoided by people with panic disorders because they panic about exercise triggering a life-threatening event. For example, obviously all panic disorders are different, but they've found that a significant amount of people who do experience panic attacks are worried about exercising because they'll feel that physiological response. They'll feel their heart rate get higher, their breathing gets shorter, they're puffing, they're short of breath, and they worry that that's going to trigger some sort of life-threatening event like a heart attack. So during exercise, the risk of a panic attack can be increased. However, long term, people who can perform physical activity see a reduction in the symptoms of their panic disorders. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, that one. Okay, so let's have a look at how exercise may promote self-esteem. Now, there's been a few theories as to the potential mechanisms of why exercise or sport might enhance self-esteem. Now, some of the theories that people have come up with as to why physical exercise can improve self-esteem are as follows. There may be an undetermined psychophysiological mechanism that enhances mood and positive self-regard. Perhaps exercise results in enhanced body image, body satisfaction, or body acceptance through weight loss or muscle gain. There may be enhanced perceived physical competence through improved physical abilities and other aspects of fitness like strength and cardiorespiratory function. There may be an enhanced sense of autonomy and personal control over your body, your appearance and its functioning. So we have this increased sense of personal control. And then finally, there might be an improved sense of belonging and significance through relationships with people in different exercise groups if you're training with people. So those are the potential ways that exercise may promote physical self-worth, self-perceptions, and self-esteem. And we can see that outlined pretty clearly in this figure here that shows a model of exercise and self-esteem. So exercise results in these changes in physical condition, attractive body, physical strength that all influence our physical self-esteem, which results in a improvement in our global self-esteem. self-esteem. So the overall conclusions about exercise and self-esteem are that positive effects can be experienced by all ages. Now, the greatest effects are seen for females, and that's generally because they score lower on measures of self-confidence, body image, self-worth, and self-esteem compared to males. And we saw that in the graph earlier in this lecture. Now, several types of exercise are effective in improving our self-perception and improving our self-esteem. However, interestingly, resistance training shows the greatest effectiveness in the short term. So if you guys have ever heard of the pre-party pump, there is some evidence to suggest that that may actually work. So the pre-party pump, for those of you who don't know, are those guys who do, 100 push-ups before going out on a night out to the clubs just so that they, look good. But it actually may positively affect their self-esteem. So why not? All right, so let's have a look at how exercise influences mood and well-being now. So we know that physical activity has this ability to energize us, and this more positive mood after exercise is widely reported. That exercise makes you feel good. You get that runner's high, endorphins, things like that. And we've seen a few studies that measure mood and well-being following exercise. We've seen that aerobic activity results in decreases in tension, decreases in depression, increased vigor, decreased fatigue, decreased confusion, and to a small effect, there is a decreased anger. So, physical activity is constantly associated with this positive mood and psychological well-being. Now, the greatest effect is seen when an individual adopts a goal in exercise that's focused on personal improvement or mastery of a skill. Group climates in exercise setting also have a positive effect on mood and well-being. So going off to an F45 class or training with some friends can further enhance that feel-good feeling after exercise. And what about pro-social behavior? Now, there's a quote there that says, "Sport builds good character." Do you agree with that? It's a very contentious comment. People are generally very undecided on whether they agree or disagree with this comment. And there's arguments for both sides. For example, you may agree with sport builds good character when you see things like cooperative game structures. They're beneficial in promoting this pro-social behavior. Pro-social behavior, it's things like helping, sharing, cooperating. It's behavior that benefits other people and society as a whole. So there is a positive effect of exercise and pro-social behavior in these cooperative game structures. And we saw an example of that at the Rio Olympics where one girl fell down, broke her ankle, and the other girl helped her to the end. So there are definitely pro-social effects of physical activity of some sports. However, there's an argument for the other side as well, where potential for competition may increase feelings of rejection and hostility. So we've got Tonya Harding down the bottom there, who was implicated in injuring her teammate to get her to the Olympics. So competitiveness can definitely also bring out negative behaviors as well. So another one is aggression, so aggressive behavior in contact sports. Now, is it because a particular sport, let's take boxing for example, attracts aggressive people? It's likely that someone who has some aggression will succeed at a contact sport like boxing, whereas someone who is not aggressive is going to struggle to be able to compete in a sport like boxing. So Does sport promote this aggressive behavior, or is it an individual factor? Does sport build good character, or can it foster these negative behaviors associated with competition? So it's an interesting question there. And then finally, are there any other negative outcomes of exercise on psychosocial development or psychosocial health? Now, when we talk about the negative psychosocial outcomes of exercise, generally the first thing people think of is exercise addiction. Now, exercise addiction is extremely rare, and it's often confused with exercise commitment. And the difference between these two is that there's a negative motivation to exercise when it's exercise addiction, and a positive motivation to exercise when it's commitment. There's been numerous studies that have found a relationship between this exercise addiction and eating disorders, so they generally occur hand in hand, and those at the greatest risks are females in weight-restricted sports. So very rare, but is a negative outcome or a negative psychosocial outcome of exercise. The other one is overtraining, and this is actually a study that I did. Overtraining, it's an imbalance of training and recovery that results in this decline in performance, and we found that it was associated with several negative symptoms. And whilst there are some symptoms on that chart that aren't psychosocial symptoms, we can pick up some of the psychosocial ones there. So general feelings of fatigue were the greatest reported symptom of overtraining. Things like lethargy, decreased motivation, poor concentration and poor sleep quality, and also irritability is associated with that overtraining as well. So there are some negative effects of exercise, and it's generally when people go to the extreme of doing so much. Okay, so a couple of key points for this part of the lecture. We've seen that exercise can be effective in improving the mental well-being of the general population, and that's largely through increases in mood and self-perception, which influences our self-esteem. And we've also seen that evidence suggests that exercise is effective for treating mental disorders or illnesses. Okay, so in this lecture, we've gone through Sigmund Freud, Erikson, our two theorists of psychosocial development. We've spoken about self-concept and morality, the two outcomes of adolescence. And we've also discussed the effects of exercise and psychosocial health.